Okay, welcome back everyone to Revolution, Socialism, and Global Conflict, the rise and fall of world communism. And today we're going to look at the East versus West, a global divide, and a Cold War. Okay, let's start with military conflict and the Cold War. So Europe was the Cold War's first arena. The Soviets were concerned for security and control in Eastern Europe, while the American and British desired for open societies that linked to the capitalist world economy. And this divide led to military rival alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The American sphere of influence was Western Europe, and it was largely voluntary, while the Soviet sphere of influence was Eastern Europe, and it was imposed. Thus, what Winston Churchill coined the Iron Curtain divided the two spheres. So at the end of World War II, quickly divided Europe into the voluntary American sphere of influence and the imposed Soviet sphere of influence. And these two competing camps became rival military alliances, staring at each other across a tense border known as the Iron Curtain. Well, there was no fighting in Europe. The hostile relations between the two sides created what is now called the Cold War. Now, communism spread into Asia, for example, China, Korea, and Vietnam, and this caused conflict. In North Korea, they invaded South Korea in 1950. In Vietnam, there was a massive U.S. intervention in the 1960s, and these are known, or what are known as, quote-unquote, hot wars during the Cold War. In Asia, the end of the Second World War created a lot of violent situations in Korea and Vietnam, especially between these communist insurgents and an alliance of local anti-communists as well as the United States. Now, while the Korean War ended with an armistice and a division of the country, North and South Korea, Vietnamese communists fought for independence from the French and then for national unity against the United States and its puppet regime. And there's also another major Cold War era conflict in Afghanistan. A Marxist party took power in 1978, but soon alienated a large portion of the population. And the Soviets sent in their military to intervene from 1979 to 1989, but they met very little success. And the Soviets withdrew in 1989 under heavy international pressure. And so the communist rule of Afghanistan soon collapsed. Now, the Marxism version of, versus Islam in Afghanistan. So in many ways, this was a reverse of Vietnam. After a communist regime came to power, it was faced with widespread insurgency over its land reform and women's rights policies. And when the USSR sent in troops, the United States began to send in aid to the Muslim rebels. And in the end, the Soviets had to pull out in the face of ongoing guerrilla actions, much as the United States had to leave Vietnam. And there's also the battle that never happened, and that was Cuba. Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, and the nationalization of U.S. assets are what provoked U.S. hostility. Castro gradually aligned himself with the Soviets, and that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. So when Fidel Castro overthrew a dictator in 1959, he launched a program that really threatened American economic interests. And so he was faced with American hostility. He drifted toward the Soviet Union and declared the revolution to be a Marxist revolution. So to protect the island from American invasion, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. And in response, President Kennedy launched a blockade. And it was a very tense 13-day standoff that actually almost led to nuclear war. But the Soviets and the United States came to an agreement, and the nuclear war was averted. Okay, and here's a nice visual showing the NATO countries here in purple, this dark purple, along with other U.S. allies like New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and a couple of countries in the Middle East, as well as even Thailand. And of course, the Warsaw Pact countries here in dark green, with other communist countries in light green. For example, China, northern Vietnam, and Mongolia. And here specifically are the NATO and Warsaw Pact countries in Europe. Again, NATO countries in purple, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact countries. And you notice, here's the Iron Curtain, where after World War II, Germany is divided between the United States and Britain and their allies, becoming West Germany, while East Germany is given to that of the Soviet Union, becoming East Germany in a heavily communist area. Okay, let's look at nuclear standoff and Third World rivalry. So the Soviet Union succeeded in creating a nuclear weapon in 1949. And that led to a massive arms race. By 1989, the world had nearly 60,000 nuclear warheads with complex delivery systems. In this 40-year period, 1949 to 1989, there was a lot of fear of massive nuclear destruction and even a possible extinction of humankind. Both sides knew how serious their destructive power was, and so there was this careful avoidance of nuclear provocation, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And there was also avoidance of any direct military confrontation, since it might turn into a nuclear war. And so there's a significant fear of nuclear war throughout the world, as both sides realized that a nuclear exchange could destroy both the Soviet Union and the United States. The superpowers redirected their energies towards competition for client states in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And thus, they both turned and courted third world countries. The United States intervened in Iran, the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, the Congo, and elsewhere because of their fear of communist penetration. And that's what's known as the containment policy, because of what's also known as the domino effect or the domino theory. That's where one country falls to communism, thus many of the others around it are likely to follow, thus the idea of the domino. And that's when the United States government undertook that policy of containment to try and contain communist countries and keep it from spreading. So aid and intervention is sent to the third world because of that fear of the spread of communism. And so it really prompted the U.S. to intervene either openly or even covertly in a number of states. And the United States extended aid packages to anti-communists, but often corrupt and authoritarian allies. And a few states, such as India, Indonesia, and even Egypt, played both sides off of each other. So the U.S. often supported these corrupt authoritarian regimes, but many resisted being used as pawns, while some took on this non-alignment status, playing both sides off of each other. And some even, and this is the way everything went in the Cold War around the world. And here's the image that's in your textbook showing a detonated nuclear weapon. And you can see the destructive power that a weapon like this has. And this is, 50 years ago. You can imagine what a nuclear weapon would be like now, as technology is far more advanced than it was 50 years ago. Okay, so let's move on to the Cold War and the superpowers. So the United States became the leader of the West against communism, and it led to the creation of an imperial presidency in the United States. Power was given to defense and intelligence agencies, creating a national security state, and it really strengthened the influence of the quote-unquote military-industrial complex. So because of the need to make quick and important decisions in the Cold War, the office of the president began to amass more and more power. With the increase in military spending, the proliferation of intelligence agencies, the United States was characterized as a national security state. And that's, while President Eisenhower warned of that growing power of the military-industrial complex. Everything is centered around the military and industry. And there was a big U.S. military effort that was sustained by a flourishing economy and an increasingly middle-class society. The U.S. industry hadn't been harmed during World War II, and that was unlike every other major industrial society. And so Americans were a people of plenty. They had a growing pace of U.S. investment abroad because they were basically unscathed from, at least on our own soil, from the detriment of World War II. And in addition to its political and military power, the United States came out of the war unharmed and enjoyed a major economic advantage over the rest of the world. It also exported much of its culture in the form of movies and food and pop culture. Like, for example, jazz, rock and roll, and rap found foreign audiences who thoroughly enjoyed those types of, or those genres of music. By the 1990s, American movies took up 70% of the European market. And by 2012, there were approximately 33,000 McDonald's restaurants in 119 countries. So that's a huge influence of the U.S. and our culture abroad. Now, Nikita Khrushchev took power in the Soviet Union in 1953. And shortly after that, in 1956, he denounced Stalin as a criminal, and that took the world by surprise because he was kind of seen as Stalin's right-hand man. But just 3 years after taking power and Stalin dies, he denounces him as a criminal. And the Cold War justified a continuing Soviet emphasis on military and defense industries. The Soviet military spending and propaganda was huge for the Soviet Union. The USSR tried to match the United States with military spending, but also pumped out massive amounts of propaganda to rationalize their economic situation and convince people that it really wasn't as bad as it was. But there were conflicts with the communist world. Yugoslavia rejected Soviet domination. The Soviet invasions of Hungary in 1956 and 1957 and Czechoslovakia of 1968 were led to try and crush these reform movements. In the early 1980s, Poland was also threatened with invasion, and it was a brutal suppression of reform that tarnished the image of Soviet communism, and it gave credence to Western views of the Cold War as a struggle between tyranny and freedom. There was sharp opposition between the Soviet Union and Chinese forms of communism. China went to war against the communist Vietnam in 1979, and Vietnam invaded communist Laos in the late 1970s. And so world communism reached its greatest height in the 1970s and declines thereafter. So there are even conflicts within the communist world. So while the communist world first seemed like a monolithic block in this stable economic and political system, with the Soviet Union leading and China to very large Asian countries, cracks appeared between the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, between the Soviet Union and China, between China and Vietnam and other Asian countries. And as the Soviet Union used military force against its Eastern European satellites and threatened war, while China briefly invaded Vietnam over Vietnam's successful invasion of communist Cambodia, in many cases, nationalism trumped Marxism. And that's where we see the difference. And that sums up the East versus West, a global divide, and a Cold War. I'll see you again for Paths to the End of Communism.